I kept the words in my mouth the way you hold a match in your fist, tight enough to hide the flame, afraid it would burn me if I let it breathe. There are moments when you feel a sentence rise up like Lex, not a speech, not a plea, just one plain warning shaped by instinct. It comes with the same certainty as pain when you touch something hot. It comes before you can dress it in politeness, before you can make it harmless, before you can convince yourself it isn't your place. And then the other reflex arrives, the one that says, stay still. Because the room is never just a room. It has weight. It has rules you don't see until you break them. It has eyes that don't have to look at you to remind you what you are. I remember the pause more than anything else. That small, suspended space where I could have been someone different, where I could have let the words out and made them real, where I could have placed them in the air between us and forced others to acknowledge what I already knew. In that pause, I heard everything that had trained me not to speak, the soft, practiced quiet of men who don't ask questions. The way bodies arrange themselves around authority without thinking, the way faces become blank when decisions are made, the way the smallest sound can feel like an accusation when everyone is waiting for the same answer, the same nod, the same compliance. My throat tightened, not from emotion, but from the body's own betrayal, muscles bracing as if the words were a threat to me, not the thing I needed to deliver. I told myself I didn't have enough certainty. I told myself I might be wrong. That doubt was a sign of humility, that silence was the responsible choice until I knew more. I told myself that blurting out a fear was not the same as offering something useful. I told myself that if the danger was real, someone else would notice it too. Someone with clearer eyes, someone with the right to speak. But the truth was simpler. It always is when you strip the story down. I was afraid of what would happen if I opened my mouth, afraid of the look I'd receive first, the brief turn of attention, the annoyance at being interrupted, the thin patience for weakness disguised as caution. Afraid of the way the air would change when the words landed, afraid that I would be made to repeat myself, afraid that my voice would shake, and the shaking would become the only thing afraid of being told, without any anger at all, to step back into the place where people like me belong. And beneath that fear, another one, that I would be right. Because being right doesn't save you. Sometimes it only makes you the first person blamed for noticing. I could feel the warning press behind my teeth, begging for shape. I could taste it, metallic, dry, like blood when you bite your tongue. My hands stayed at my sides, useless and obedient, but I felt them twitch with a need to do something, anything, as if motion could substitute for courage. The others around me breathed evenly. Boots shifted, fabric creased. There were ordinary sounds, routine sounds, as though the world hadn't narrowed to a single decision balanced on a thin edge. And I watched myself from a distance, as if I were already someone recalling it years later, a figure holding a sentence like contraband, waiting for the moment to pass so he wouldn't have to choose. Then, the moment arrived, quiet, unremarkable, almost gentle, and I let it go. I lowered my eyes. I swallowed. I made my face still, and the words stayed with me, carried along. By the time the day took its shape, I already understood how sound worked there. Not noise. Noise was everywhere. Engines, boots, metal against metal, voices calling out instructions that no one questioned because they had been heard 1,000 times before. Noise was safe. It blended in. It asked nothing of you. It was silence that carried risk. The kind that settled after an order was spoken. The kind that followed a pause too long. The kind that suggested hesitation where none was expected. Everything moved according to patterns that didn't need explanation. You learned them the way you learn the weight of your own body, through repetition, through correction, through watching what happened to the ones who didn't learn fast enough. No one ever sat you down and said, "This is how authority works here." You absorbed it through posture, through tone, through the way certain men were listened to even before they spoke. There was a clear slope to every conversation. Words flowed downhill. They were shaped at the top and carried downward, changing slightly as they passed through each layer, but never reversing direction. When someone above you spoke, you didn't meet their eyes unless invited. You didn't interrupt unless the interruption had already been approved in advance. You didn't frame concerns as questions unless the answer was already known. The structure wasn't cruel. That was the most unsettling part. It was efficient, calm, almost polite. No one raised their voice without reason. No one threatened openly. Consequences were rarely mentioned because they didn't need to be. Everyone had seen enough to understand what happened when someone disrupted the flow. I wasn't important enough to be watched closely, and that made me careful. People like me survived by being useful and forgettable at the same time. You learned when to speak just enough to confirm you were paying attention, and when to disappear into the background so decisions could pass over you without friction. The spaces where decisions were made were not dramatic. There were no speeches, no long debates. Just a gathering of figures who already knew what they were expected to decide, moving through the ritual of confirmation. Maps were consulted. Notes were exchanged. Small adjustments were discussed with the seriousness of men who believed order itself was a form of safety. I stood close enough to hear everything, far enough to never be asked for my opinion. That position gave you a particular kind of clarity. You saw how certainty was performed, how confidence didn't always come from knowing, but from needing to appear as though you knew. You noticed the way doubts were redirected into logistics, the way unease was smoothed over by procedure. When something didn't quite fit, it wasn't addressed directly, it was reframed, reworded, folded into the plan until it stopped being sharp. The language itself worked like padding, softening edges that might otherwise cut. And no one questioned that language, not openly. You learned that authority wasn't just held by individual, but by the rhythm of agreement. A nod here, a brief acknowledgement, a silence that confirmed alignment. Breaking that rhythm didn't just challenge a person, it challenged the process, and the process was sacred. I had seen what happened to men who mistook proximity for permission. They weren't punished in obvious ways, they were corrected, redirected, assigned elsewhere. Their names stopped appearing on lists that mattered, their presence became optional. Over time, they learned to speak less, or not at all. Fear didn't announce itself as fear. It disguised itself as professionalism, as discipline, as respect for the chain that kept everything from unraveling. By the time I recognized the flaw form, it already felt too late to name it, not because the moment had passed, but because the environment had already decided how it would respond to dissent. I could imagine the room tightening if I spoke, the slight shift in posture, the glance exchanged between those who understood how disruptions were. It wasn't that I believed I knew better than it. That belief would have been easier to confront. What troubled me was the sense that no one was looking in the direction I couldn't stop watching, that the thing I saw sat just outside the approved frame, invisible not because it was hidden, but because acknowledging it would slow everything down, and slowing down was dangerous. So I stood where I was meant to stand. I listened when I was meant to listen. I absorbed the atmosphere of quiet certainty, and told myself that this was how order was maintained, that speaking up without invitation wasn't courage, was recklessness. Around me, the machinery of decision continued to turn, smooth and confident, and I remained exactly where the structure had placed me, close enough to understand, far enough to stay silent. Once the awareness settled in, it didn't announce itself as panic. It arrived quietly, like a thought you don't remember inviting but can't send away. It stayed with me through routine movements, through repeated actions that normally required no reflection. I could perform everything expected of me while that single awareness remained just beneath the surface, pressing upward whenever there was a pause long enough to think. I began to argue with myself in fragments, not full sentences, just impressions, sensations. A tightening in the chest when certain details were mentioned. A subtle resistance when plans were restated, with more confidence than they deserved. My mind returned again and again to the same point, circling it without landing, as if naming it outright would make it too real to manage. I told myself that my position distorted my view, that closeness to small details could create the illusion of larger problems. That distance was what produced clarity, and I didn't have it. I told myself that those above me had access to information I didn't, that what looked incomplete from where I stood might already have been accounted for elsewhere, discussed behind closed doors I'd never enter. That explanation worked for a while. It always does. But the doubt didn't fade. It adjusted. It learned to hide in plain sight. I noticed how my attention sharpened at moments that should have felt ordinary, how my body reacted before my thoughts could organize themselves. A slight pause in breathing, a hand tightening around an object for no reason I could explain. These reactions embarrassed me more than they alarmed me. They felt like signs of weakness, proof that I was letting imagination interfere with discipline. I tried to force myself back into neutrality. I focused on procedure, on the comfort of repetition. I reminded myself that uncertainty was constant in war, that if hesitation dictated action, nothing would ever move forward. I borrowed phrases I'd heard before, things said by men who sounded calm when they said them, and repeated them internally until they dulled the edge of my concern. There were moments when I almost spoke, not during the main discussions. Those felt sealed, impenetrable. But after, in the spaces between, while walking, while waiting, when someone stood close enough that a quiet word might not travel. In those moments, the warning pressed forward again, shaped now as a question rather than a statement, a careful phrasing designed not to challenge, only to clarify. I rehearsed it silently, adjusted the wording, removed anything that sounded like accusation. I imagined saying it casually, as though it had only just occurred to me. I imagined the response, brief, reassuring, confident. I imagined the relief I would feel afterward, having transferred the burden of concern onto someone else. But I also imagined the other response, the look that would come first, before any words, the evaluation, the recalibration of how I was seen. I imagined being told that it had already been considered, that the issue was understood, that the plan accounted for variables I couldn't possibly be, and I imagined what would remain unsaid in that exchange, that my role was not to notice such things, and certainly not to question them. Each time, the imagined consequences outweighed the imagined. I became skilled at delaying myself. I learned how to let the moment pass without it being obvious, how to glance away at the right time, how to stay occupied, how to appear attentive while avoiding the risk of engagement. Silence, I discovered, was not just the absence of speech. It was an active behavior, something you maintained through effort. As time moved forward, the warning changed shape. It grew heavier, less precise. No longer a single thought, but a pressure that accompanied everything else. I stopped trying to define it because definition would have demanded action. Instead, I allowed it to exist as a vague unease, something I could acknowledge privately without ever translating it into words. I told myself that responsibility was shared, that no single voice could alter the course of what was already in motion, that if the danger was real, it would reveal itself soon enough, and then adjustments could be made without drawing attention to who had noticed it first. These justifications didn't bring peace, they brought endurance. By the time the moment I feared began to approach, my silence no longer felt like a choice. It felt like momentum, like something I had already agreed to, repeatedly, in smaller ways. And the space where a warning could have lived grew narrower with each passing hour, until even I wasn't sure anymore how it would have sounded if I'd tried to give it voice. The moment arrived without ceremony. There was no signal that this was the point where everything narrowed, no change in lighting, no shift in voices. It came the way most irreversible moments do, quietly, tucked inside something that looked routine enough to pass unnoticed. Someone spoke, not loudly, not forcefully, just with the confidence of someone whose words were expected to be accepted. The decision was framed as a continuation, not a departure, a small adjustment, presented as refinement rather than risk. It carried the familiar cadence of authority, measured, calm, already moving forward even as it was being articulated. I felt it before I understood it. A tightening low in my stomach, a sudden awareness of my own breathing, shallow and uneven. The warning surged up fully formed for the first time, no longer vague, no longer abstract. It was there, complete and undeniable, demanding release. This was it, something inside me said, not loudly, not dramatically, just with certainty. I remember the sensation of heat in my, as if blood had rushed there to announce my presence against my will. My mouth opened slightly, not enough to speak, just enough to betray intention. I could feel the muscles in my jaw resisting, holding the words in place like a clenched fist holds back a blow. Time did something strange, not slowing, not stopping, compressing. Everything seemed to crowd into a single, suffocating second. The decision continued to unfold in front of me, syllable by syllable, while my own internal debate collapsed into something raw and wordless. If you speak now, you cannot take it back. The thought wasn't philosophical, it was physical. I felt it in my chest. Heavy and immediate. Speaking would change the shape of the room. It would redraw invisible lines. It would mark me as a disturbance in a system that prized smooth movement above all else. I looked at the faces around me. They were attentive, composed, already aligning themselves with what was being said. No one looked uncertain. No one looked relieved. They looked settled, ready to move on. There was no invitation for interruption. The words pressed harder, desperate now, as if they understood the cost of delay better than I did. I could feel my pulse in my throat. My hands had gone numb. I became acutely aware of how small any sound I made would seem against the authority already filling the space, and how large it would feel once it broke the silence. I imagined the first word leaving my mouth, just one, enough to slow things down, enough to create friction. I imagined the immediate pause that would follow, the attention swinging toward me like a spotlight I had never wanted. I imagined the subtle tightening of expressions, the calculation behind the eyes. I imagined being wrong. Not catastrophically, worse, slightly wrong, inconveniently, wrong in a way that justified dismissal without discussion, wrong in a way that confirmed I had spoken out of turn. And beneath all of that, I imagined being right, and what that would demand of me afterward. Questions, responsibility, the expectation that I continue to speak, that I defend the concern I had raised, that I stand by it even as pressure mounted. I realized then that I didn't fear the words themselves. I feared the path they would put me on. The decision reached its natural end. A pause followed, brief, procedural, the kind that exists only to confirm that nothing else needed to be added. The air felt taut, stretched thin between what had been said and what had not. That pause was my last opening. I felt my chest rise as if my body were preparing to speak on its own. For a fraction of a second, I thought it might, that the reflex would override caution and force the words out despite everything I had rehearsed against them. Instead, I did something smaller. I swallowed. The motion was barely noticeable, a simple, human reflex, but it closed my throat just enough. The words fell back, colliding with doubt and fear, and everything I had taught myself about survival. My gaze dropped, not in shame, but in surrender. I fixed my eyes on something unimportant and let the moment pass over me. Someone else nodded. Another voice affirmed the decision. The machinery moved on, and just like that, the silence became permanent. I felt it settle into me, heavy and unmistakable. Not relief, not safety, something colder. A sense of finality that spread slowly, like numbness after pain. The realization that the warning now belonged entirely to me, sealed inside, stripped of any remaining utility. The room resumed its rhythm. Chairs shifted, papers were gathered, conversation loosened slightly, already turning toward what came next. The decision had been absorbed into the flow, indistinguishable from all the others that had come before it. No one noticed my silence. That was the most devastating part. I stood there, unchanged on the outside, while something essential had quietly. The moment for words had closed, not with resistance, but with my consent. And I understood, with a clarity that left no room for comfort, that whatever followed would unfold without my voice in it. Because when it mattered most, I had chosen not to speak. What followed did not arrive all at once. There was no single instant where the fear I had carried finally stood up and announced itself as truth. Instead, it emerged gradually, almost politely, as though it didn't want to draw attention to the fact that it had been waiting all along. At first, nothing appeared different. Movements continued. Messages were passed. The routines that had always given the illusion of control resumed their familiar cadence. If I hadn't been holding the silence inside me, I might have mistaken the calm for confirmation that the decision had been sound. But the calm felt thinner now. I began to notice small deviations. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that could be pointed to without sounding unreasonable. Delays that lasted just a little too long. Information that arrived incomplete, or not at all. Faces that tightened briefly before returning to neutrality. The kind of details that only mattered if you already feared what they implied. Each one struck me like a quiet acknowledgement. I found myself listening differently, not for reassurance, but for cracks. Every update carried weight, not because of what it said, but because of what it avoided. The language grew careful, vague. Words were chosen to maintain momentum, to keep everything moving forward without inviting questions that no longer had answers. No one spoke of error, no one spoke of doubt, they spoke of adjustments. I remember the moment when it became impossible to pretend anymore, not because something catastrophic happened in front of me, but because the pattern revealed itself. The same tension I had felt earlier now echoed in the behavior of others, subtle, restrained, unspoken. It was as if the awareness I had carried alone had begun to distribute itself throughout the space. Too late to be useful, there was a heaviness in the air that hadn't been there before. Conversations shortened, eye contact lingered, then broke. People avoided standing too close to one another, as though proximity might invite responsibility. The machinery still moved, but without confidence. Like something turning on inertia, alone. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt hollow. Each confirmation landed inside me with a dull, sinking weight. Not triumph, not anger. Just the quiet recognition that the warning had been accurate, and therefore, unforgivable. Because accuracy didn't undo what had already been set in motion. It only clarified my role in letting it proceed. I watched consequences unfold at a distance that felt intentional. I was present, but never central. Involved enough to witness, removed enough to remain untouched by blame. That distance protected me in practical terms, but it stripped away any illusion that I had been powerless. Powerlessness would have been easier to live with. There were moments when I caught fragments of conversation that mirrored my thoughts. Hints of concern phrased too carefully to challenge what had already happened. Observations delivered with resignation rather than urgency. I wanted to speak then, not to warn, but to confess, to say that I had known, that I had felt this coming, that the silence others now shared had once been mine alone, but confession would have served no one. The cost had already been, just not by me. I began to understand that silence doesn't end when the moment passes. It lingered. It reshapes how you move through everything that follows. I measured my reactions, careful not to reveal recognition it wasn't welcome. I learned to absorb confirmation without expression, to let each new development settle quietly into the space the warning had once occupied. Sleep became fragmented, not from images, but from repetition. The same thought returned each time I closed my eyes. Not dramatic, not accusatory, just persistent. A simple awareness looping without resolution. I had seen this before. I had felt it before, and I had said nothing. The realization didn't break me, it wore me down. By the time the full weight of what had happened could no longer be ignored, it felt strangely distant, like something that belonged to another version of myself, the person who stood in that earlier room, holding words he believed he could carry alone. I still carried them, but now they were heavier, altered by reality, no longer hypothetical. They had substance, memory, consequence. And as the days passed, I understood that whatever had been lost would never be traced back to my silence. Not officially, not openly, which meant the burden of knowing would remain exactly where it had begun, with me. Time did not dull it. That surprised me more than anything else. I had believed, as people often do, that memory softens with distance, that repetition erodes sharp edges, that eventually the mind grows tired of revisiting the same moment and allows it to fade into something manageable. Instead, the silence settled in and stayed. It followed me into places where it no longer belonged, into rooms that had nothing to do with that, into conversations that should have felt ordinary, into stretches of quiet where thought was free to wander. It didn't arrive as guilt at first. It arrived as presence, a weight that reminded me I was still carrying something unfinished. I would remember it without warning, not the outcome, not the sequence of events, but the pause. That fraction of time where the future was still open, where nothing irreversible had yet occurred. The stillness before I swallowed, the exact sensation of choosing not to act. That moment became fixed, immune to distortion. I could replay it endlessly, and it never changed. Sometimes I tried to examine it the way an outsider might, to dissect my reasons, to weigh my fear against the structure that had shaped it, to see if there had truly been any room for a different choice. This exercise never brought relief. It only produced variations of the same conclusion. There had been a moment, however narrow, where speech was possible, and I had declined it. The world moved on, as it always did. New routines replaced old ones. Different decisions occupied attention. Names changed. Faces disappeared. But the silence did not age alongside these. It remained exactly as it was, untouched by time's erasure. I learned that guilt doesn't always announce itself as pain. Sometimes it presents as restraint, a hesitation where there should be, a carefulness that borders on withdrawal. I noticed how often I stopped myself from speaking even when it was safe, how the habit of silence, once formed, extended far beyond its original necessity. I became quieter than I had ever been before, not visibly, not in a way anyone commented on, but internally, something withdrew. I measured words more carefully. I avoided certainty. I left thoughts unexpressed even when no one would have challenged them. The silence had taught me something dangerous, that withholding was survivable. What it did not teach me was how to live with what remained unsaid. There were nights when memory refused to stay abstract, when it attached itself to sounds, to shadows, to the faint suggestion of motion. I would wake with the awareness already present, as if my mind had been rehearsing the same scene without me. In those moments, I didn't see faces. I felt the absence of my own voice. That absence became a constant reference point. Every time I witnessed someone speak up and alter the course of something, however small, I felt a dull recognition, not admiration, not regret in its sharpest form. Just an acknowledgement of difference, of the path not taken. I never told anyone what I had carried, not because I feared consequences anymore, but because the truth had lost its usefulness. There was no setting where it could be offered without sounding like justification, confession, or an attempt to share weight that no one had agreed to carry, so I kept it. Over time, the silence stopped feeling like something I was holding. It began to feel like something that defined me, not visibly, not in ways that could be named, but as a boundary I could not cross. A reminder of the limits I had accepted. I understood then that some choices don't echo outward, they echo inward, endlessly, reshaping the space where certainty might have lived. The words I carried never changed. They never softened into something less demanding. They remained as they had always been, simple, unspoken, and unbearably intact. And even now, long after everything else has blurred, they are still there, not as a warning, not as a lesson, just as proof that silence, once chosen, does not fade, it stays.